What's up, Remnant family? Welcome back to the channel. Before we dive in, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell because today's video is one you won't want to miss. Today we're exploring a dark chapter of American history, and unfortunately it's still being written. We're talking about 10 American towns where crime didn't just increase, it completely spiraled out of control. These aren't just numbers on a page. These are real communities where families have been shattered, where children grow up hearing gunshots instead of laughter, and where entire neighborhoods have been abandoned to decay and violence. From the Rust Belt to the Deep South, from bustling cities to forgotten towns, we're going to uncover the shocking truth about what happened when law and order broke down. Some of these stories might surprise you. Others might break your heart, but all of them are important to understand. So grab some snacks, settle in, and let's dive deep into this disturbing reality. Let's get into it. Town number 10, Gary, Indiana. We're starting our countdown in the heartland of America with Gary, Indiana, a city that went from the American dream to an American nightmare in just a few decades. Picture this, it's the 1950s and 60s and Gary is booming. US Steel built this town and it was thriving. The population reached over 178,000 people. Working class families owned homes, kids went to good schools, and the future looked bright. Gary was the embodiment of industrial America's promise. But then everything changed. As the steel industry began its decline in the 1970s and 80s, Gary's economy collapsed like a house of cards. The factories that employed tens of thousands of workers began shutting down or moving operations overseas. Unemployment skyrocketed to over 25% in some neighborhoods. Families who had lived there for generations were forced to leave, searching for work elsewhere. With economic devastation came social collapse. As the middle class fled, poverty took root. And with poverty came drugs, specifically crack cocaine in the 1980s. The crack epidemic hit Gary like a tsunami. Street gangs like the Gangster Disciples and Vice Lords moved in to control the drug trade, turning once peaceful neighborhoods into war zones. By the 1990s, Gary had earned a terrifying distinction, one of the highest murder rates per capita in the entire United States. In 1993 alone, there were over 100 murders in a city whose population had shrunk to under 120,000. That's a murder rate that rivals active war zones. Walking through Gary today is like visiting a post-apocalyptic movie set. Entire city blocks are abandoned. The famous Methodist church, once a beautiful landmark, stands in ruins. Houses that once sheltered families are now crumbling shells, windows broken, roofs caved in. Over 13,000 abandoned buildings dot the landscape. That's roughly 1/3 of all structures in the city. The police department, severely underfunded and understaffed, struggles to maintain order. Response times can be dangerously long. Some areas are so dangerous that even delivery drivers refuse to enter. But here's what really breaks my heart. There are still people living in Gary, good people trying to raise their families and maintain their dignity in the face of overwhelming odds. These residents deserve so much better than what their city has become. Town number 9, Camden, New Jersey. Just across the Delaware River from Philadelphia sits Camden, New Jersey, a city that became so dangerous they had to disband the entire police force and start over from scratch. Let me give you some context. Camden was once a thriving industrial city, home to major companies like RCA Victor and Campbell Soup. In the 1950s, nearly 125,000 people called Camden home. It was a city of opportunity where working class immigrants could build a better life. But the same story that devastated Gary repeated itself in Camden. Deindustrialization gutted the city's economy. The factories closed, the jobs disappeared, the tax base evaporated, and the people who could afford to leave did. By the 1980s and 90s, Camden had transformed into one of America's most dangerous cities. Drug trafficking became the primary economy. The streets were controlled by violent gangs. Murders became routine. In 2004, Camden had 45 murders. By 2012, that number had jumped to 67 in a city of only 77,000 people. That's a murder rate of 87 per 100,000 residents, making it statistically more dangerous than many cities in active conflict zones around the world. But here's where it gets even crazier. The Camden Police Department itself became part of the problem. Corruption was rampant. Officers were caught stealing drugs from evidence rooms and selling them back on the streets. Some cops were literally working with the gangs they were supposed to be fighting. Trust between the community and law enforcement completely broke down. In 2012, city officials made an unprecedented decision. They disbanded the entire police department. Every single officer was let go. They started over with a completely new county police force, implementing community policing strategies and accountability measures that the old department had lacked. And you know what? It actually started working. Violent crime began to decline. Murder rates dropped. By 2017, murders were down to 23, still way too high, but a massive improvement from the peak. But Camden's problems are far from over. Poverty remains crushing. Over 36% of residents live below the poverty line. Many neighborhoods still look like war zones with abandoned buildings and vacant lots. Drug addiction continues to plague the community. Children still grow up in an environment where where violence is normalized. Camden's story shows us something important. When things get bad enough, sometimes you need radical change. But it also shows us that rebuilding trust and safety takes time, resources, and commitment, things that many struggling cities simply don't have. Town number 8, East St. Louis. I know East. If you want to understand how a city can completely collapse, look no further than East St. Louis, Illinois. This is a city that quite literally went bankrupt financially, socially, and morally. East St. Louis sits right across the Mississippi River from St. Louis, Missouri, but don't let the similar names fool you. These are two very different places. In its heyday during the early 1900s, East St. Louis was a booming industrial city with meatpacking plants, aluminum ore processing, and manufacturing. At its peak in the 1950s, over 82,000 people lived there, but the decline was swift and brutal. As industries closed and white flight accelerated, especially after the devastating 1917 race riots, the city's tax base disappeared. By the 1970s and 80s, East St. Louis was in freefall. Here's where things get really dark. Organized crime and political corruption took over the city. The local government became essentially a criminal enterprise. Politicians were openly taking bribes. City contracts went to mob-connected companies. The police force was so corrupt that drug dealers operated with impunity, sometimes with police protection. In 1990, East St. Louis had a murder rate of 88 per 100,000 residents. Entire neighborhoods were controlled by gangs. The city couldn't afford to pay its employees. Firefighters worked without proper equipment. Schools crumbled. Streetlights went dark because the city couldn't pay the electric bill, and it got worse. In the mid-1990s, the state of Illinois had to step in and take over the city's finances because it was essentially bankrupt. The city couldn't provide basic services. Garbage piled up in the streets. Buildings burned down and were never demolished, becoming dangerous ruins where drug users and criminals congregated. I want you to imagine living in a place where calling 911 might not bring help for hours, if at all. Where your children go to schools with leaking roofs and no textbooks. Where getting a job means leaving your own city because there are no employers left. That's the reality thousands of people in East St. Louis faced. Today, the population has dropped to under 20,000, less than a quarter of what it was at its peak. Entire city blocks are empty. Of the residents who remain, nearly 45% live below the poverty line. The median household income is around $26,000, less than half the national average. East St. Louis ranks as one of the most dangerous cities in America year after year. Violent crime rates remain extraordinarily high. Property crimes are rampant. The few businesses that exist have bars on every window and armed security. This is what happens when a city doesn't just decline, it collapses entirely. East St. Louis is a cautionary tale of how economic devastation, political corruption, and social abandonment can create a perfect storm of urban destruction. Town number 7, Flint, Michigan. You probably know Flint, Michigan because of the water crisis that made international headlines. But the poisoned water was just one symptom of a much deeper sickness that had been festering in Flint for decades. Let's go back to better times. In the 1950s and 60s, Flint was Vehicle City, the birthplace of General Motors and one of the most prosperous cities in America. GM employed over 80,000 people in Flint. The UAW was born here. The population reached nearly 200,000. This was a city where a high school graduate could get a union job, buy a house, raise a family, and retire with a pension. It was the American dream in action. Then came the downfall. Starting in the 1970s, GM began closing plants and moving operations overseas or to southern states with cheaper labor. By the 1980s and 90s, tens of thousands of jobs had disappeared. Unemployment soared. Those who could afford to leave did. The population collapsed to under 100,000. As poverty exploded, so did crime. By the 2010s, Flint consistently ranked among the most dangerous cities in America. In 2012, Flint had 63 murders in a city of less than 100,000 people. That's a murder rate of 62 per 100,000, higher than many cities twice its size. Gang violence took over entire neighborhoods. Areas like the North End became no-go zones after dark. Drug houses operated openly. Carjackings became so common that residents learned to never stop at red lights in certain areas. Copper thieves stripped abandoned houses and even occupied homes of all valuable metal. Arson was rampant. Hundreds of buildings were deliberately burned each year. The police department was overwhelmed and underfunded. At one point, Flint had fewer than 100 officers to patrol a city of nearly 100,000 people. That's one officer for every 1,000 residents, far below what's needed for effective policing. Response times for 911 calls stretched to dangerous lengths. Residents felt abandoned. Then came the water crisis. In 2014, to save money, city officials switched Flint's water source from Lake Huron to the Flint River without proper treatment. The corrosive river water leached lead from old pipes, poisoning the entire city's water supply. Children were exposed to dangerous levels of lead, which causes irreversible brain damage and developmental problems. But here's the truly criminal part. Officials knew about the problem and covered it up for months while residents, including pregnant women and babies, continued drinking poisoned water. The water crisis wasn't just a failure of infrastructure, it was a failure of government, morality, and basic human decency. The combination of violent crime, economic devastation, government corruption, and literal poisoning of the population created a crisis that Flint is still struggling to overcome. Many residents still don't trust the tap water, even years later. The city is trying to replace all the lead pipes, but it's a massive and expensive undertaking. Flint shows us how multiple crises can compound each other, creating a situation where residents are attacked on every front: economic insecurity, physical danger from crime, and even poisoned by their own government. It's a betrayal of the most fundamental social contract between a city and its people. Town number 6, Memphis, Tennessee. Memphis, Tennessee, the home of blues music, Elvis Presley, and world-famous barbecue, also has a much darker side that doesn't make it into the tourism brochures. For decades, Memphis has struggled with violent crime rates that rank among the worst in the nation. Unlike the Rust Belt cities we've discussed, Memphis never experienced the same kind of industrial collapse. It's still a major city with a metropolitan population of over 1.3 million. Phaetex has its global headquarters there. The city has a thriving tourism industry. St. Jude Children's Research Hospital calls Memphis home. On paper, Memphis should be thriving. But the statistics tell a different story. Year after year, Memphis ranks as one of the most dangerous cities in America. The violent crime rate is more than double the national average. In 2022, Memphis saw 302 homicides, and in 2023, that number remained stubbornly high at over 290. For context, that's nearly one murder every single day in a city of 630,000 people. What makes Memphis different is the geographic concentration of crime. The city is deeply divided between relatively safe, affluent areas and neighborhoods where violence is epidemic. Areas like Orange Mound, Fraser, and Westwood are plagued by gang violence, drug trafficking, and shootings. Gang culture runs deep in Memphis. The city has been a battleground for gangs like the Gangster Disciples, Vice Lords, and Crips for decades. These aren't just small-time street crews, these are sophisticated criminal organizations involved in drug trafficking, weapon sales, and violent territorial disputes. Drive-by shootings are tragically common. In some neighborhoods, residents have become so accustomed to gunfire that they barely react anymore. Children sleep on the floor to avoid stray bullets coming through walls. Parents live in constant fear for their kids' safety. The carjacking epidemic in Memphis has become particularly notorious. In 2022 and 23, Memphis experienced a surge in violent carjackings that shocked the nation. Criminals, often teenagers, would approach vehicles at gas stations, red lights, or in parking lots, threaten victims with guns, and steal their cars. Some victims were shot, others were dragged by their own vehicles. The brazenness of these crimes was stunning. The Memphis Police Department has faced its own serious challenges. Underfunding and understaffing have plagued the department for years. Officer morale is low. Recruitment is difficult, and scandals have eroded public trust, including the horrific beating death of Tyre Nichols by Memphis police officers in 2023, which was captured on video and sparked national outrage. What makes Memphis's crime problem particularly frustrating is that solutions seem within reach. The city has resources, major employers, and institutions. But deep poverty in certain neighborhoods, combined with inadequate educational opportunities, lack of economic development, and historical racial segregation, have created pockets of concentrated disadvantage where crime thrives. Memphis represents a different kind of urban crime crisis, not a city in total collapse like Gary or East St. Louis, but a major metropolitan area that has failed to address deep-rooted inequality and violence affecting significant portions of its population. It shows that economic growth and prosperity in some parts of a city don't automatically translate to safety and opportunity for everyone. Town number 5, Birmingham, Alabama. Birmingham, Alabama, once known as the Magic City for its rapid industrial growth, has struggled with violent crime for decades. This is a city with a complicated and painful history, and that history still casts long shadows over its present. In the early 1900s, Birmingham was booming, fueled by iron and steel production. The city grew so fast it seemed magical, hence the nickname. But Birmingham is also infamous for its role during the civil rights movement. In the 1960s, it was known as Bombingham because of the numerous racist bombing attacks against black homes and churches, including the horrific 16th Street Baptist church bombing that killed 4 young girls in 1963. That legacy of violence unfortunately didn't end with the civil rights era. As Birmingham's industrial base declined in the 1970s and 80s, the city faced rising unemployment and poverty. And with economic hardship came crime. By the 1990s and 2000s, Birmingham had some of the highest murder rates in the South. The city consistently appeared on lists of America's most dangerous cities. Certain neighborhoods became synonymous with gang violence and drug trafficking. Areas like Ensley, Pratt City, and Kingston have been particularly affected. These neighborhoods, once home to thriving working-class communities, have been devastated by poverty and violence. Abandoned houses line the streets. Businesses have fled. Those who remain often live in fear. Gang violence in Birmingham is driven by several factors. Drug trafficking, particularly crack cocaine and later heroin and fentanyl, has fueled much of the violence. Gangs fight over territory and market control. Retaliation killings create cycles of violence that span years and claim multiple generations of victims. In 2019, Birmingham had 111 homicides in a city of about 210,000 people. That's a murder rate of nearly 53 per 100,000 residents, putting Birmingham among the top 10 most dangerous cities in America that year. What's particularly tragic is the youth violence. Birmingham has seen heartbreaking cases of teenagers, even children, being killed in shootings. Some were innocent bystanders. Others were involved in gang activity themselves, often because they saw no other path forward in communities with few opportunities. The Birmingham Police Department has struggled with the same issues facing many urban police forces, understaffing, budget constraints, and difficulty recruiting new officers. Community relations have been strained. Many residents in high-crime areas feel both over-policed and underprotected, experiencing aggressive policing tactics while also feeling that serious crimes go unsolved. Birmingham has made efforts to address its crime problem. Community organizations work tirelessly to provide alternatives for at-risk youth. Violence intervention programs try to mediate conflicts before they turn deadly. The city has invested in urban renewal projects to revitalize struggling neighborhoods. But progress has been slow and uneven. Birmingham still ranks among America's most dangerous cities. It's not enough to simply increase policing. You have to address the root causes: poverty, lack of opportunity, failing schools, and the despair that comes from feeling forgotten by society. Town number 4, St. Louis, Missouri. St. Louis, Missouri consistently ranks as one of the most dangerous cities in America, and sometimes even the most dangerous. The gateway to the West has become a gateway to violence, poverty, and urban decay in many of its neighborhoods. St. Louis has a unique geographic situation that affects how its crime statistics are reported. The city of St. Louis is separate from St. Louis County, meaning the city limits only include about 300,000 people, while the greater metropolitan area has over 2.8 million. This matters because crime statistics are based on the city population, making the rates appear even more extreme. But make no mistake, the crime problem in St. Louis is very real. In 2020, St. Louis had a murder rate of 87 per 100,000 residents, the highest in the nation. In 2021, there were 263 homicides. In 2022, that number was 200. These aren't just statistics. These are lives lost, families destroyed, communities traumatized. The north side of St. Louis has been particularly devastated. Neighborhoods that were once vibrant communities have been hollowed out by decades of disinvestment, white flight, and redlining. Areas like Wells Goodfellow, Jeff Vanderloo, and O'Fallon have murder rates that would be shocking even in war zones. Gang violence and drug trafficking drive much of the bloodshed. St. Louis has been a major hub for drug distribution for decades. Gangs control territory and fight viciously to maintain their markets. Retaliation killings are common. Young men, often still teenagers, are caught up in cycles of violence that seem impossible to escape. What makes St. Louis's crime problem particularly complex is the city's deep segregation and inequality. The divide between North St. Louis and South St. Louis, between the city and the county, between black neighborhoods and white neighborhoods, is stark. Life expectancy can vary by over 20 years between zip codes just miles apart. Educational opportunities, employment prospects, and access to resources are vastly different depending on where you live. Residents of high-crime neighborhoods describe living in a constant state of fear and trauma. Gunshots ring out nightly. Children learn to recognize the difference between fireworks and gunfire before they learn to read. Parents forbid their kids from playing outside. Memorial sites with flowers and teddy bears mark where yet another young person was gunned down. The St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department has faced criticism from multiple directions. Some community members feel over-policed and harassed while simultaneously feeling that serious crimes go unsolved. Clearance rates for homicides are disappointingly low. Many murders go unsolved, leaving families without justice and communities without closure. Police staffing has been a major issue. The department has struggled to recruit and retain officers. Officer morale is low. Resources are stretched thin. And scandals, including cases of police misconduct and corruption, have damaged community trust. St. Louis has tried various approaches to reduce crime. Violence intervention programs work to mediate conflicts. Community organizations provide support and alternatives for at-risk youth. The city has invested in urban renewal and economic development projects in struggling neighborhoods. But the challenges are immense. Poverty rates in some neighborhoods exceed 40%. Unemployment is high. Schools are underfunded and struggling. Many residents feel abandoned by government and society, forgotten in neighborhoods that seem to exist outside the prosperity visible in downtown or the county. St. Louis shows us how segregation, inequality, and concentrated poverty create the conditions for endemic violence. It's not enough to simply arrest more people or increase police presence. Real solutions require addressing systemic issues, investing in education, creating economic opportunities, providing mental health and addiction services, reforming policing, and fundamentally reimagining how we build equitable cities. Town number 3, New Orleans, Louisiana. New Orleans, the Big Easy, the birthplace of jazz, home to Mardi Gras and incredible cuisine, is also one of America's most violent cities. Behind the festive facade of the French Quarter lies a city that has struggled with crime for decades. New Orleans has always had a complicated relationship with crime. The city's permissive culture, its role as a major port, and its history of political corruption created conditions where organized crime and vice could flourish. But things got dramatically worse after Hurricane Katrina in 2005. When Katrina hit, it didn't just flood the city, it exposed and exacerbated every existing problem. The storm displaced hundreds of thousands of residents. It destroyed homes, schools, hospitals, and infrastructure. And in the chaos that followed, law and order broke down completely. Images of looting and violence in the days after Katrina shocked the nation. But what many people don't understand is that the disaster also devastated the social fabric of communities. Neighborhoods were scattered, extended families that had provided support systems for generations were separated. People lost everything. When residents began returning to rebuild, they found a city transformed. Many of the poorest neighborhoods, especially the lower Ninth Ward, were left to rot. Insurance companies refused to pay out claims. Government aid was slow and inadequate. People were abandoned. In this environment, crime exploded. By 2007, New Orleans were routine. Young men joined gangs for protection and income in communities with few legitimate opportunities. Innocent people were caught in crossfire. What made New Orleans' crime problem even worse was police corruption. The New Orleans Police Department had a long history of misconduct, but after Katrina, it reached shocking levels. Officers were caught looting. Some were involved in drug trafficking themselves, and in several horrific cases, police officers were convicted of murder. The most notorious case was the Danziger Bridge shootings, where NEPD officers shot unarmed civilians in the days after Katrina, killing 2 people and wounding 4 others, then engaged in an elaborate cover-up. Multiple officers were eventually convicted and imprisoned, but the scandal devastated what little trust existed between the community and police. The police department was so dysfunctional that in 2012, the federal government stepped in with a consent decree, essentially putting NOPD under federal oversight. The department was ordered to implement sweeping reforms to address corruption, use of force issues, and discriminatory policing. Today, New Orleans still struggles with high crime rates. In 2022, there were 280 murders in a city of about 380,000 people. That's nearly 1 murder every single day. Certain neighborhoods remain extremely dangerous, but there's also resilience and determination. New Orleans has a strong sense of community and cultural identity. Residents love their city fiercely. Community organizations work tirelessly to provide alternatives for young people. Violence interruption programs try to stop conflicts before they turn deadly. The challenge is that New Orleans faces the same issues as other cities on this list: deep poverty, failing schools, lack of economic opportunities, and the trauma of violence that perpetuates itself across generations. Tourism thrives in the French Quarter and Garden District, but just blocks away, people live in third world conditions. New Orleans shows us how natural disasters can amplify existing problems and how rebuilding physical infrastructure isn't enough. You have to rebuild social infrastructure, trust, and opportunity as well. Town number 2, Baltimore, Maryland. Baltimore, Charm City, has been anything but charming for many of its residents. For decades, Baltimore has struggled with some of the worst crime rates in America, and the problem shows no signs of going away. If you've watched the HBO series The Wire, you've seen a dramatized but largely accurate portrayal of Baltimore's crime problem. The show depicted the city's drug trade, gang violence, political corruption, and failing institutions. And here's the thing, it wasn't really exaggerating. Baltimore's problems have deep historical roots. The The city was heavily industrialized in the early and mid-25th century, with steel mills, shipyards, and manufacturing providing good jobs for working-class residents. But like many American cities, deindustrialization gutted Baltimore's economy starting in the 1970s. As jobs disappeared, poverty increased, white flight accelerated, the tax base eroded, schools deteriorated, and into this void came the drug trade, first heroin in the 1960s and 70s, then crack cocaine in the 1980s and 90s. The crack epidemic hit Baltimore like a bomb. Violence exploded as gangs fought for control of the lucrative drug markets. Murder rates soared. In 1993, Baltimore had 353 homicides in a city of about 730,000 people. But things got even worse. In 2015, after the death of Freddie Gray in police custody sparked protests and riots, Baltimore experienced a massive spike in violence. In 2015, there were 344 murders. In 2016, 318. In 2017, a staggering 340 murders. In 2019, Baltimore reached a horrific milestone, 348 murders, giving it the highest per capita murder rate of any major US city. That's more than one murder every single day in a city whose population had shrunk to about 600,000. The murder rate was over 58 per 100,000 residents, higher than many countries at war. West Baltimore has been the epicenter of violence. Neighborhoods like Sandtown, Winchester, where Freddie Gray lived, Harlem Park, and Druid Heights have murder rates that are almost incomprehensible. In some neighborhoods, the annual murder rate exceeds 100 per 100,000 residents. Walking through West Baltimore is like visiting a war zone. Entire blocks of row houses are abandoned, windows boarded up or smashed, roofs caving in. These aren't just eyesores, they're criminal havens where drug dealers operate and violence occurs away from witnesses. The drug trade in Baltimore is sophisticated and entrenched. Gangs control specific corners and blocks, operating 24/7 drug markets. Dealers work in shifts. Lookouts watch for police. Runners transport drugs and money. Violence is used to enforce discipline, punish theft, and eliminate competition. Young boys, sometimes as young as 10 or 12, are recruited as lookouts and runners. By their mid-teens, many are dealing drugs themselves. By their early 20s, many are dead or in prison. It's a pipeline to destruction that claims generation after generation. The Baltimore Police Department has been part of the problem, not the solution. Corruption within BPD has been extensive and shocking. The most notorious case was the Gun Trace Task Force, an elite unit that was supposed to get illegal guns off the streets but instead became a criminal gang itself. GTTF officers robbed drug dealers and civilians, planted evidence, falsified reports, and sold drugs they stole. They made millions of dollars. When the scandal broke in 2017, 8 officers were indicted and 7 were eventually convicted and sent to federal prison. The corruption scandal devastated community trust and emboldened criminals who knew the police were discredited. BPD has also been under a federal consent decree since 2017 due to patterns of excessive force, discriminatory policing, and constitutional violations. The department is supposed to be implementing reforms, but progress has been slow. Baltimore faces enormous challenges. Over 20% of residents live in poverty. The median household income is well below the national average. Schools are failing with some of the worst outcomes in the nation. Lead paint poisoning affects thousands of children. Drug addiction is epidemic. But there are also people fighting for change. Community organizations like Safe Streets work to interrupt violence before it happens. Churches provide support and sanctuary. Activists demand better from politicians and police. Residents refuse to give up on their city. Baltimore shows us how crime can become self-perpetuating when institutions fail, when poverty becomes concentrated, when young people see no path forward except the drug trade, and when the police themselves become criminals. Breaking these cycles requires fundamental changes that Baltimore has yet to achieve. Town number 1, Chicago, Illinois. And now we reach number 1, Chicago, Illinois, the Windy City, the second city. And unfortunately, a city that has become synonymous with gun violence and gang warfare. Let me be clear, Chicago is a massive, diverse city of 2.7 million people. Downtown Chicago, the Loop, the Magnificent Mile, Lincoln Park, these areas are vibrant, safe, and prosperous. Tourism thrives. The economy is strong. World-class universities, museums, and cultural institutions call Chicago home. But Chicago is also a city of shocking inequality and concentrated violence. While some neighborhoods are among the safest in America, others are among the most dangerous. And it's these neighborhoods, primarily on the south and west sides, that have made Chicago infamous. Chicago sees hundreds of murders every year. In 2021, there were 797 homicides, the highest in 25 years. In 2022, that number was 697. In 2023, it dropped to around 617, still averaging nearly 2 murders every single day. And these numbers don't include the thousands of people shot and wounded each year. The violence is overwhelmingly concentrated in specific neighborhoods. Areas like Inglewood, Austin, West Garfield Park, and South Shore experience levels of violence that are hard to comprehend. In these neighborhoods, the murder rate can exceed 100 per 100,000 residents, higher than many war zones. Gang violence drives much of the bloodshed. Chicago has hundreds of active gangs, some affiliated with larger organizations like the Gangster Disciples, Black P. Stones, Vice Lords, and Latin Kings, others smaller neighborhood crews. These gangs fight over territory, drug markets, and slights real or perceived. What makes Chicago's gang violence particularly deadly is its fragmented nature. There isn't a small number of large gangs fighting each other. Instead, there are hundreds of small sets and cliques, often consisting of just a few dozen members, each claiming a few blocks as their territory. This fragmentation leads to constant, unpredictable violence. Social media has made things worse. Gangs taunt and threaten each other online. They post videos mocking dead rivals. They reveal locations and movements. Conflicts that might have stayed verbal escalate to violence. Young people brag about shootings online, creating evidence that leads to their arrest but also to retaliation. The availability of guns is another major factor. Illinois has relatively strict gun laws, but Chicago is surrounded by areas with lax gun regulations. Guns flow into the city in huge numbers. High-capacity magazines and even fully automatic weapons appear regularly in gang violence. Innocent people are caught in the crossfire constantly. Children are shot while playing in their yards. People are killed sitting on their porches. Funerals become targets for retaliation. In some neighborhoods, residents live in a state of constant trauma, always vigilant, always afraid. The psychological toll is immense. Children in high-violence neighborhoods show symptoms of PTSD at rates similar to combat veterans. Educational achievement suffers when kids are traumatized and afraid. Economic development is impossible when businesses won't invest in areas perceived as war zones. The Chicago Police Department is one of the largest in the country with over 13,000 officers. But CPD has faced serious challenges and controversies. The department has a troubled history of corruption, excessive force, and racial bias. The Laquan McDonald case, where a teenager was shot 16 times by a police officer and the department covered it up, led to federal intervention. CPD has been under a consent decree requiring reforms to address constitutional violations. Community trust in police is low, especially in the neighborhoods most affected by violence. Many residents feel simultaneously over-policed and underprotected, experiencing aggressive tactics while seeing murders go unsolved. The clearance rate for homicides in Chicago is disturbingly low, often around 50% or less. That means half or more of murders go unsolved. Witnesses are afraid to come forward. Gang code prohibits cooperation with police. Without witnesses, cases fall apart. Chicago's violence is driven by deep systemic issues. The South and West sides have been systematically disinvested in for decades. Schools are underfunded and struggling. Unemployment, especially youth unemployment, is high. Poverty is concentrated. Opportunities are scarce. Segregation in Chicago is among the worst in the nation. The city is starkly divided along racial lines, with Black and Latino residents concentrated in specific areas that have been neglected for generations. This segregation concentrates poverty and violence while isolating communities from resources and opportunities. Politicians have tried various approaches. Community policing initiatives aim to rebuild trust. Violence intervention programs work to mediate conflicts. After-school programs try to keep kids off the streets. Economic development efforts attempt to bring jobs and investment to struggling neighborhoods. But the scale of the challenge is enormous. Decades of disinvestment and neglect can't be reversed quickly. The trauma of violence perpetuates itself across generations. Without fundamental changes to address inequality, poverty, and lack of opportunity, the cycle continues. Chicago represents the ongoing struggle many American cities face: how to break cycles of poverty, violence, and despair that have become entrenched over generations. How to rebuild trust between communities and institutions. How to create opportunity where none exists. How to heal trauma that affects entire neighborhoods. There are no easy answers, but what's clear is that the current approach isn't working. Chicago, like the other cities on this list, needs comprehensive solutions that address root causes.